Welcome back to the illumilands podcast. In the last episode, I went over the logical problem of evil and showed a major difficulty with it that has made a lot of people very wary of the argument. Now, in this episode, I will be turning to the second type of problem, which is the probabilistic problem of evil. Remember, if you like the episode, click the like button and be sure to subscribe to keep up with my newest videos. So, with that said, let's get into the video. Due to the crucial flaw in logical problems of evil that I explained in the last episode, many philosophers have abandoned those arguments in favor of probabilistic problems of evil. Even if God and evil are logically compatible, their coexistence could still be very unlikely. And this is precisely what probabilistic problems of evil attempt to prove. One of the best defenses of this argument comes from the collective effort of William Roe and Michael Martin, both 20th century philosophers. Roe presents the argument, and a later effort by Martin in his book Atheism, A Philosophical Justification, perfectly summarizes and bolsters this argument. I'll also reference Graham Oppy's arguing about gods. So, the core argument formulated by Roe goes as follows. Premise 1, there exist instances of intense suffering which God could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil, equally bad or worse. Now that's a mouthful of a premise. Basically, what it's saying is that there are cases in the world that God could have changed and he would have made the world better, essentially. Or at least not made it worse. Premise 2, God would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering he could, unless he couldn't do so, without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally as bad or worse. So this premise is just saying that God would endeavor to get rid of all such evils. So if there is an evil in the world whose removal would not make the world worse or would make it better, then God would do that. That's essentially what premise 2 is saying. And premise 3, or the conclusion rather, God does not exist. When defending the premises, Roe begins with premise 2, because he views this as less controversial. Because these premises are pretty wordy, some of the discussion around them is also a bit wordy. So, for example, when defending the premises, Roe begins with premise 2, because he views it as less controversial. He says, assuming some instance of intense suffering, S, so we can call S an instance of intense suffering. Assuming some instance of intense suffering will occur unless prevented by God, we can say that a necessary condition for God's failing to prevent S is the following. Either there is some greater good that can be reached only by allowing S, or something equally bad, or S can only be prevented by allowing something at least as bad. This is just a very, very wordy way, again, of expressing what premise 2 is. It's the statement that God would get rid of these seemingly pointless evils. Premise 2 is a specific version of the broader claim that God's existence implies a justification for all the world's evil. that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. But it's more than just the statement that God would have morally sufficient reasons. It's a claim about the conditions under which God would fail to prevent evil. That said, Rowe also wants us to notice that premise 2, quote, does not describe what might be a sufficient condition for God to permit intense suffering, only what is a necessary condition. This is a distinction between a sufficient and a necessary condition. A sufficient condition is a case where if the condition is in place, the effect will follow. It has to follow. A necessary condition is a condition where if it's not met, something becomes impossible. But that doesn't mean that if it's met, that thing automatically will happen. It's just that if the thing happens, this condition was met. That's the difference between a sufficient and a necessary condition. Furthermore, premise 2 seems to express a belief that accords with our basic moral principles, principles shared by both theists and non-theists. It only seems natural that if God could increase the overall balance of goodness over evil, he would. This is really the only defense that Rowe gives for premise 2, but admittedly, it's not a bad defense. There are lots of theists who agree that if God could prevent an evil without making the world worse, then he just would. And they would also probably believe that he has, and that there is no pointless or unjustified or quote-unquote excessive evil. Moving to premise 1, the statement that boiled down basically says there are unjustified evils, Rowe begins his defense with a thought experiment. Quote, suppose in some distant forest lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless, for there does not appear to be any greater good such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse. Nor does there seem to be any equally bad or worse evil so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented. An omnipotent, omniscient being could have easily prevented the fawn from being horribly burned, or, given the burning, could have spared the fawn the intense suffering by quickly ending its life, rather than allowing the fawn to lie in terrible agony for several days. Unquote. That's quite an example. Now, what can we conclude from this example? Rowe acknowledges that, quote, the case of the fawn's apparently pointless suffering does not prove that premise 1 is true. For even though we cannot see how the fawn's suffering is required to obtain some greater good, or to prevent some equally bad or worse evil, it hardly follows that it is not so required. It would seem to require something like omniscience on our part before we could lay claim to knowing that there is no greater good connected to the fawn's suffering. Unquote. Just because we can't see a greater good the suffering achieves, that doesn't mean we know with certainty there isn't one. That's what Rowe's getting at. It also shows why Rowe rejects logical problems of evil. He agrees it is simply humanly impossible to know with certainty that no justification for evil exists. Again, it would seem to require something like omniscience on our part. Of course, even if we can't know something with certainty, we can often have rational grounds for believing something. Are there rational grounds for taking the fawn's suffering as unjustified? To help answer this, Rowe asks a few questions. Quote, is it reasonable to believe that there is some greater good so intimately connected to that suffering that even God could not have obtained that good without permitting that suffering or some evil, at least as bad? Unquote. We're certainly not rationally justified in believing this directly. That is, we aren't justified in believing it unless we hold a separate justified belief that makes it more probable. Similarly, it doesn't seem reasonable to directly believe there is some evil, at least as bad as the fawn's suffering, such that God simply could not have prevented it without permitting the fawn's suffering. Furthermore, quote, we must ask whether it is reasonable to believe either of these things of all the instances of seemingly pointless human and animal suffering that occur daily in our world. The answer for Rowe is an obvious no. He concludes, quote, it seems quite unlikely that all the instances of intense suffering occurring daily in our world are intimately related to the occurrence of greater goods, or the prevention of evils at least as bad. And even more unlikely should they somehow all be so related that God could not have achieved at least some of those goods, or prevented some of those evils, without permitting the instances of intense suffering that are supposedly related to them. Although we cannot prove that premise 1 is true, it is nevertheless altogether reasonable to believe that premise 1 is true, that one is a rational belief, unquote. For the sake of clarity, Michael Martin presents the support for premise 1 in 4 main points. First, our knowledge of the vast amount of human and animal suffering that occurs daily in our world, that is, a lot. Second, our understanding of the goods that do exist and that we can imagine coming into existence. So this is Rowe's appeal, saying that there doesn't appear to be any greater good. So we're thinking about greater goods. We can't think of any greater good. That is somewhat support for this. Third, our reasonable judgment of what an omniscient being can do, i.e., prevent said evil. And fourth, our reasonable judgment of what an omniscient and wholly good being would endeavor to accomplish with respect to human and animal good and evil in the universe. Both premise 1 and premise 2 seem at least rationally supported, so it looks like, quote, we have rational support for atheism. It is reasonable for us to believe that the theistic God does not exist, unquote. So let's go back and examine the case that's been made so far. Premise 2, I'll start with, because Rowe also starts with it. It does, as Rowe says, accord with the basic moral principles of most theists and atheists. So I am inclined to view premise 2 as, at the worst, only minorly problematic. Again, at the worst. One might, as Alvin Plantinga has done, provide an in-depth analysis of the necessary conditions for God's preventing or permitting an evil. And their account may differ slightly from Rowe's, but at least from my readings, I've seen no analyses different enough to undercut Rowe's argument. I'm perfectly willing to accept Rowe's stated necessary conditions unless and until rationally persuaded otherwise. So this is to say, I think that even though I wouldn't say I know 2 is true, premise 2 at least seems true. It seems true to me. Premise 1, however, does not leave unscathed. While the argument to premise 2 is plausible, the argument to premise 1 is notoriously tricky to assess. I say notoriously tricky because the strength of the argument is at least somewhat dependent on your own point of view. Ultimately, as I shall argue, the argument should appear unpersuasive and unsound to a theist. It should appear unpersuasive, though possibly sound, to an agnostic, and it should appear persuasive and sound to an atheist. In establishing the truth of premise 1, Rowe asks whether or not it is reasonable to believe that there is a greater good connected to the fawn's suffering, such that even God could not have obtained that good without permitting the suffering, or some evil at least as bad. Because the answer to this question is no, and we can ask the same question of all seemingly pointless sufferings, Rowe concludes it's unlikely that every seemingly pointless suffering, nevertheless, has a sufficient underlying condition. But this conclusion is not proven by the no answers to the previous question. Just as we can ask if it's reasonable to believe there is justification for the fawn's suffering, we can and must ask if it's reasonable to believe there is not such a justification. The problem is, Rowe's reasons for thinking unjustified evils exist are largely only relevant to the non-theist. God's existence entails there must be a justification for evil. Or I should rephrase that. God's existence plus evil's existence entails there must be a justification for evil. Considerations of the vast amount of suffering, the potential goods we can imagine coming into existence, and what God would endeavor to accomplish might be convincing to someone already an atheist, and perhaps rightly so, but the theist has a ready response to all of these, and Rowe himself notes this. The theist can reject the argument simply by using a Morean shift. For those unfamiliar, a Morean shift occurs, and bear with me here, when the denial of an argument's conclusion is taken as a premise in a new argument for the purpose of undermining a premise in the original argument. Yes, that was a mouthful. Let me explain what I mean. The 20th century philosopher G.E. Moore famously gave a quote-unquote proof of an external world beyond experience in response to the radical skeptical view that we can't actually know there's an external world. The skeptical argument goes as follows. Premise 1, if external world skepticism is correct, I do not know there is an external world. Premise 2, external world skepticism is correct. Conclusion, I do not know there is an external world. That was the skeptical argument. Of course, only skeptics themselves accept premise 2, which says external world skepticism is correct. So, while the argument could and should be persuasive to a skeptic, it shouldn't be so to someone who already accepts the existence of an external world. The believer in an external world, in this case Moore, can thus present an analogous argument. Premise 1, if external world skepticism is correct, I do not know there is an external world. Premise 2, I know there is an external world. Conclusion, external world skepticism is not correct. So this is a Morean shift. More has taken the conclusion of the skeptical argument, denied it, and put it as one of the premises of his new argument. And the conclusion is the denial of one of the premises in the original skeptical argument. I know, it's a mouthful. Now, the skeptic might respond, you can't counter my argument simply by assuming external world skepticism is false, but that's essentially what your second premise is doing. But this perfectly illustrates More's point, for he can make exactly the same charge against the skeptic. You can't counter my argument simply by assuming I don't know there is an external world. But that's essentially what your second premise is doing. The skeptic can insist he's justified in accepting his own second premise. More can likewise insist he's justified in accepting his own second premise. The point is, the skeptic's position can only be accepted if it is more probable than my knowing there is an external world. It's a battle of premise twos. Is my knowledge of an external world more plausible than the skeptic's principles? This logical move, the Morean shift, is best represented by the saying, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. And if you're familiar with logical forms of argumentation, then that'll be a little comedic. In this same manner, the theist can make a counter-argument to the problem of evil. God exists. Now insert premise 2. God would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering he could, unless he could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally as bad or worse. Now we have a new conclusion. Therefore, it is false that there exist instances of intense suffering which God could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. This is an explicit denial of premise 1. Again, it's a battle between two premises. In the problem of evil, that unjustified evil exists. And in the theistic argument, that God exists. The atheist might respond, you can't counter the problem of evil by simply assuming God exists, but that's essentially what you're doing. You can't refute an argument by simply assuming the opposite of its conclusion. But see, the theist can make exactly the same charge against the atheist. You, Mr. Atheist, cannot counter my argument against unjustified evils by simply assuming there are unjustified evils, but that's essentially what you're doing. The atheist insists he's justified in thinking unjustified evils probably exist. The theist likewise insists he's justified in thinking God exists. The point is, the existence of truly unjustified evil can only be accepted if it's more probable than my knowing there is a God, and vice versa. This is why both atheists and theists accept the existence of, quote, apparently pointless evil, but differ on what to make of this apparently pointless evil, this appearance of pointlessness. This is also why, from the theist's perspective, The atheist often appears to shift the burden of proof, and similarly how, from the atheist's perspective, they have upheld their burden of proof and are rightfully waiting for a response to this, specifically in the form of a theodicy, an argument outlining God's specific justification. The atheist, lacking the belief that there is a justification for evil, can only establish a supposed justification through bottom-up reasoning. That is, from the atheist's point of view, there's no reason to think the whole of reality includes God. So there's no point in applying the ramifications of God's existence top down to each instance of apparently pointless evil. Because the theist's only reason for thinking there are no unjustified evils is that God exists, the atheist has no indication that some overarching justification for evil exists, and thus he cannot interpret evil in light of this assurance. The atheist's only recourse is to assess intense evils on a case-by-case basis and try to glean supposed justifications from them. Confronted with countless situations of apparently unjustifiable evil, the atheist concludes that probably at least one of those situations is actually unjustifiable. And if it's actually unjustifiable, then God probably doesn't exist. This is why Rowe, paraphrased by Michael Martin, concludes that, quote, as far as we can determine, the suffering serves no greater good at all, let alone one that is otherwise unobtainable by a God. It is incredible that all instances of suffering that served no greater good we know or can think of should nevertheless be such that none could have been prevented by God without loss of greater good. Surely it's rational for an atheist to conclude, upon finding no plausible justification for several particular evils, that probably at least one of those evils is actually unjustified, if not several of them. Granted, he has no reason to think the system as a whole, that is, something about the world, implies that all evils have a sufficient justification. In that case, virtually any reason is enough to lightly tip the scales in favor of unjustified evils. Quote, that things appear to us a certain way is itself justification for thinking things are this way. Of course, this justification may be defeated, but apart from such defeat, the fact that things appear to us to be a certain way renders us rationally justified in believing that they are that way. Unquote. On the other hand, the theist, having reason to suppose there are no unjustified evils, rightly notes that the atheist's considerations are of little consequence to the theist. No matter how much seemingly pointless evil there is, it's simply a tenet of theism that God has sufficient justification for evil. So long as the one confronted with the argument is a theist, they can always counter by appealing to their reasons for thinking God exists. Only a theist with no good reason for their theism should cease believing in God, and it still isn't even clear that they should believe God doesn't exist. So far, I've shown that an atheist should accept the problem of evil as at least weak evidence against God's existence. A theist with no justification for their theism should likewise accept the problem of evil as weak evidence for atheism, mainly because they shouldn't be a theist in the first place. That said, the justified theist can simply use their justification to offset the evidence for unjustified evils. And personally, people differ on their conceptions of justification. I am including in this things like deeply felt emotional experience, personal experience, what people call religious experience. Some people take that as their justification, and I think that even if they might be wrong about having a real religious experience, I still think that they can be justified in believing it was a real religious experience, an experience of something actual and objective. Now, if you believe that a justified belief can only be held if you have evidence for the belief, then I think that's personally too strict a notion of justification, because then we couldn't justify our most fundamental beliefs. So beliefs in the reality of the objective world, beliefs in the reliability of our cognition and our process of reasoning. We can't prove any of these things. There's no evidence you could give for any of those things. So, if we have reason to think unjustified evil does not exist, we have positive reason to reject the problem of evil. This describes the Morean shift approach. I want to push things a step further than Rowe did in his article. Instead of ending his paper with his discussion of premise 1, which he could have done, Rowe was kind enough to give the theist a response to his own argument. In the same fashion, I now ask, how can atheists best respond to a theist invoking a Morean shift against premise 1 of the problem of evil? There are two ways to support premise 1, but only one should really convince the theist. First, the atheist could present other arguments against God's existence. Now, to some, this might sound strange, maybe even stupid. After all, if the problem of evil is supposed to be an argument for atheism, but its success requires an appeal to other arguments for atheism, isn't this circular? Why not just appeal to those other arguments? So, I am sympathetic to those questions, those critiques, though I bring this potential response up because, as I already noted, God's non-existence does make it more probable that unjustified evil exists. If someone believes other independent arguments for atheism are sound, they can use this as justification for thinking there is unjustified evil. The problem with such a response, as just noted, is that it's argumentatively powerless. It could only ever be persuasive to an atheist. If the overarching topic at hand is the existence of unjustified evil, it's relevant and non-circular. But the fundamental discussion is about the problem of evil's strength as evidence for atheism, and given that, the response is circular. Our evidence for unjustified evil is, in part, proportional to our evidence for atheism. But the former probability is also proportional to something else, namely the probability, given theism, that we should expect to discern God's justification for evil. If atheists could successfully show this is probable, they would have evidence persuasive to both parties. The atheist can possibly accept this because it's only a conditional statement about a theistic world. And the theist can possibly accept this because it doesn't contradict God's existence. It assumes it. What reasons are there for thinking we should expect to discern God's justification for evil? After all, such an expectation seems at face value, a bit presumptuous. I'm not going to evaluate these reasons here, as I'm going to devote the next episode entirely to them. I suspect the supporting reasons would be similar to those in arguments from hiddenness. For example, that God wouldn't want us to be in the dark with respect to evil, and could reveal his justification in an appropriate way. It's not clear that a compelling case can be made for this, and the theist can always attempt to respond with an argument why we should not expect to discern God's justification. But if an atheist came up with a rationally compelling reason for thinking we would expect to grasp God's reasons, this would be a great tour de force, demanding a response by theists. And with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you all very much for listening to the podcast. Again, it means the world to me. I love getting this stuff out there for all of you to absorb and take in and process and respond to. Objections, too. If you have objections, I might almost prefer those to statements of agreement. So if you have objections to what I've said, absolutely feel free to leave those in the comments. It is much appreciated, and I do read the comments. And with that said, I say goodbye to all you lovely folks. See you in the next episode.